Douglas Carver woke on Father's Day in his small Texas home just outside Houston, the sun already hot enough to promise a long, bright morning. He shuffled into the kitchen in his faded blue t-shirt and poured strong black coffee from the French press, the bold aroma filling the room where his wife Marisol was setting plates for breakfast. Their daughter Emily, now 25, had been distant lately, busy with her new husband Caleb and their mounting bills, so he half expected a card and maybe chocolates. At 8:15, the familiar rumble of the UPS truck rolled down their quiet tree-lined street, and the driver handed Douglas a medium-sized brown box without a return address. "Happy Father's Day," the driver said with a polite nod before climbing back into his seat and rumbling away. Douglas carried the box inside and placed it on the kitchen table beside the empty cereal bowls. Curious, he brushed away crumbs and patted the top of the package. There was no return label, no scribbled "to Dad," just his name and address printed neatly. "Well, I guess Emily still remembers," he said, turning to Marisol. She studied the box with narrowing eyes, and after a moment, her gaze fixed on two tiny round holes on the front and side of the cardboard. "Don't open it," she whispered, stepping back. Douglas frowned. "Why not? It must be some gift she ordered." He bent to look more closely and saw faint scratches just inside the holes and a barely audible rustle. His heart thumped. "Marisol, that doesn't look like shipping damage." She shook her head, voice tight. "Those are breathing holes. Something alive is inside." Her words hit him like a cold wave. He straightened, adrenaline surging, and the box suddenly looked menacing. His hands trembled as he lifted his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff's office," he said. Police arrived within 10 minutes. Deputy Ramirez and an animal control officer moved everyone back to the living room and set up a careful perimeter around the box. Douglas and Marisol watched from the hallway as the officer, wearing gloves, used a box cutter to slice open the top flap. From inside came a soft hiss and a thin, scaled head emerged. A 3-foot corn snake, its tongue flicking in and out as it tried to sense the room. The animal control officer carefully coaxed it into a secure container while Deputy Ramirez looked at Douglas. "You did the right thing calling us," she said gently. "This is obviously meant to scare you." Douglas's hands clenched at his sides. "My daughter, Emily." His voice cracked. The officer did not press further. After they left, Douglas sank into a kitchen chair and Marisol joined him with 2 glasses of water. He stared at the now empty spot on the table, the same spot where he'd once opened Emily's handmade Father's Day cards in past years. He felt a hollow ache as memories of pancake breakfasts and pink handprints on construction paper filled his mind. He had worked overtime for decades, selling his old truck to help pay for her college, writing check after check to cover her emergencies. He had believed those calls for help were genuine needs, not excuses. Marisol reached for his hand. "This was no accident or prank," she said quietly. Douglas nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "It was planned." He thought of the late-night charge on his credit card for an exotic animal supplier, something he had dismissed until now as a mistake, and the way Emily and Caleb had always seemed to pop up with new crises when his savings dipped dangerously low. "She learned how to get money from me too well," he whispered. The simple act of caring had become a weapon in Emily's hands. Marisol squeezed his hand and steeled her expression. "You need to protect yourself now." Douglas rose, determination replacing shock. He walked to his home office and opened his desk drawer, pulling out the bundle of bank statements he'd been meaning to review. For years, he'd delayed tightening his accounts, never wanting to believe his own daughter could turn on him. Today, relief and pain warred inside him as he placed a "Do Not Authorize" sticker on his joint account paperwork. He began drafting a plan in his notebook, listing actions. Remove Emily's name from accounts, change passwords, call the attorney about revising the will so that any inheritance would go into a trust for grandchildren, not accessible to Emily or Caleb. Each bullet point felt like a small step back toward the security he once took for granted. Marisol brought him more coffee and watched him write. He looked up and gave her a grateful, sad smile. "I'll do it tonight," he said, voice steady. The betrayal cut deep, but he knew it was time to end the cycle of enabling. Somewhere inside him, a new resolve was born. He would remain a loving father, but no longer an open wallet. The snake in the box was a twisted symbol of Emily's broken trust, and now it would be the catalyst for his own protection. As the Texas sun climbed higher, Douglas felt the warm light fade into a harder brightness, mirroring the clarity settling in his mind. This Father's Day would not be about forgiveness, at least not yet, but about setting boundaries. The man who once believed love meant saying yes to every request was ready to say no, for the first time in 30 years. And though it pained him, he knew it was the only path back to a safe, honest relationship with his daughter, if any relationship could survive this hidden bombshell of revenge. Douglas sat at his sturdy oak desk long after sunset, the warm glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the papers strewn before him. In the dim light, he flipped through the bank statements and credit card records that had once comforted him, proof that he could always help Emily when things got tough. Now those pages felt like evidence in an investigation, proof that his daughter and her husband had learned exactly how to exploit his generosity. Each record showed a familiar pattern: an emergency call from Emily, his heart racing at the thought that his little girl was in trouble, and his signature on another wire transfer to cover her latest crisis. He remembered the first time she'd called, aged 22, and desperate after a medical bill she'd neglected to insure, her voice trembling as she insisted she had nowhere else to turn. He'd taken out a personal loan to cover it because he felt it was his duty as a father. Then there had been the time she lost her job and needed rent. Then the time Caleb had racked up debt at an online poker site and claimed he'd had insider information about a big payout. Douglas had believed them because he loved them and wanted to protect them, and because he never imagined such love could be returned with betrayal. Tonight, as he turned the pages, he recalled the late-night hours he'd spent balancing their budget, the weekend barbecues he'd postponed to make phone calls to mortgage companies, the way he'd sold his father's old pickup truck to pay off Caleb's last gambling debt. He remembered Marisol's gentle warnings, how she'd watched him hunched over the phone and said, "Doug, they're taking advantage of you." But he'd brushed her off, saying he'd handle it. Each time, Emily had thanked him, promised it would be the last request, and then asked again a month later when a new bill came due. Now, for the first time, he saw the pattern clearly. Need, guilt, payment, relief, repeat. He had become less a father and more a walking ATM in their eyes. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped behind his head, and stared at the ceiling. The soft tick of the clock on the wall sounded loud in the quiet study. He thought of the box on the kitchen table that morning, the tiny breathing holes, the rustle of the snake inside, and realized it was more than a cruel prank. It was a challenge. It said, "You love money more than your own safety, and we know how to get it." His chest tightened at the thought of Emily and Caleb giggling as they watched him panic, recorded on some hidden camera like a perverse Father's Day video. For a moment, anger flared so hot that he could almost hear himself shouting their names. But Marisol had taught him that control was more powerful than fury. So instead of letting rage rule him, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the silent street lined with trees, their leaves still shimmering from the day's heat. He remembered how this house had once been a symbol of his family's safety, a place where he taught Emily to ride her bike, where they gathered for holiday dinners, where he and Marisol had spent late nights talking about dreams for the future. That future had once included helping Emily launch her business, supporting her wedding, and spoiling her first child. But now those things felt like mistakes, steps that had led to her believing her father's wallet was limitless. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew what he had to do, though it hurt more than he cared to admit. Turning back to the desk, he picked up the phone and called his bank's fraud department, requesting to freeze all account transfers and remove Emily's name as an authorized user on every credit card and bank account. The automated voice on the other end asked security questions he answered without hesitation. Then he called their mortgage company to stop automatic withdrawals for Emily's home loan, explaining he would be making payments directly, but no longer authorizing her husband's account. Each call felt like tearing a page out of his heart, but with every confirmation number, he felt a tiny weight lift from his shoulders. Next, he opened his laptop and drafted an email to his attorney, Margaret Summers, asking her to prepare a revised will that placed any inheritance into a trust for his future grandchildren, accessible only by an independent trustee. He explained the snake incident as evidence of Emily and Caleb's willingness to manipulate and intimidate for money, and he asked Margaret to draft the trust so that no funds would be released until the grandchildren reached adulthood, and then only for educational or medical purposes. He wrote clearly, using simple language, ensuring the intent was unmistakable. He loved his daughter, but he would no longer enable her destructive behavior. As he typed the words, he felt tears sting his eyes, but he pressed on, determined to set boundaries he should have set years ago. By the time he sent the email, the lamp had burned through 2 desk lamps, and the night was deep. He closed the laptop and reached for the glass of water Marisol had left on the desk. She appeared in the doorway, hugging something behind her back. "I thought you might need a snack," she said, offering him a granola bar. He took it gratefully, and she sat beside him, her presence calm and unwavering. He told her in simple words what he'd done: cut transfers, changed account access, called the lawyer. She listened without interrupting, her hand resting on his. When he finished, she exhaled a long breath. "It's painful," she said, voice soft, "but necessary." He nodded, feeling both loss and relief swirl inside him. They stayed in the study for a while longer, talking quietly about how to face Emily and Caleb when they next called, or if they came to the door. He planned to change his phone number and block theirs if needed. Marisol suggested he might need counseling to process the betrayal. He agreed, but told her he would wait until after the trust was in place. Finally, he stood and turned off the desk lamp. Together, they walked down the hall to their bedroom, the house silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. As he slid into bed, he thought of the morning's events, how the snake had been the hook that revealed the deeper truth about his daughter's manipulation. And though it pained him to acknowledge it, he knew his love for Emily was real, but his obligation to protect himself, Marisol, and any future grandchildren was stronger. As he closed his eyes, he repeated a quiet promise. Tomorrow, he would meet with Margaret. And then, finally, his family's future would be secure, free from intimidation and hidden venom, just like the snake that had sparked this long overdue reckoning. That next morning, Douglas woke before dawn, the Texas sky still dark outside his window, and he felt a curious mix of dread and resolve as he slid out of bed to meet with Margaret Summers at her downtown law office. He dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark trousers, shaved off the stubble that had grown during his sleepless nights, and kissed Marisol gently on the forehead before heading out. The drive through quiet streets felt surreal after the events of the past 2 days, as if he were on autopilot toward a courtroom rather than his daughter's life. When he reached Margaret's marble-floored office, she greeted him with a warm, professional smile and ushered him into her conference room, where a stack of papers lay on the polished wood table. "Douglas," she said, "I've drafted the trust documents and the modification to your will, and I've also prepared the petition for a protective order against Emily and Caleb. Let's go through each item and make sure everything is exactly how you want it." He nodded, his throat tight, and sat down across from her. She walked him through the trust paperwork first, explaining in plain English that any assets intended for his heirs would now be held by a neutral third-party trustee and released only for the grandchildren's education or health needs. Douglas asked questions about how the trustee would verify expenses, how distributions would be made, and whether there could be exceptions in case of real emergencies. Margaret answered patiently, assuring him that the trust could be amended later if circumstances changed, but that this version would make it impossible for Emily or Caleb to withdraw any funds. Next, she showed him the new will language in which Emily received a nominal inheritance of $1, enough to prevent a legal challenge, while most of the estate was directed into the educational trust for Emma and Jake. When she asked him to initial each page, his hand shook, but he confirmed every line. Finally, they turned to the protective order. Margaret read aloud the facts he had provided: the relentless extortion, the live snake shipped through the mail, the threats to cut off his grandchildren, and the verbal intimidation on the porch. The judge needed specific dates, but Margaret explained they could use the morning of the snake delivery, the call he made to his bank that night, and the confrontation at his front door 2 days later. Douglas supplied the exact times from his phone log and the UPS receipt. As Margaret typed, she said, "This order will bar them from coming within 500 feet of you or Marisol, contacting you by phone or email, and using the grandchildren as leverage in any way. If they violate it, they face arrest." He felt a chill but nodded. By the time they finished, the late morning sun was high, and Margaret's assistant brought iced water. "Everything is ready for your signatures," Margaret said, passing him a pen. Douglas signed the trust, the will addendum, and the protective order petition in one smooth motion, each signature marking a boundary he had never before set with his own flesh and blood. When he handed back the documents, Margaret smiled sympathetically. "I'll file these today and arrange for service of the order on Emily and Caleb. The trust will become effective as soon as the will is admitted to probate. You've done the right thing to safeguard yourself and your grandchildren." Douglas felt a tight lump in his throat, grief for his daughter mixed with relief that this nightmare might finally end, and he thanked Margaret before leaving the office. Outside, the midday heat pressed against him as he drove home, every red light feeling like a long pause in his life. When he stepped through his front door, Marisol met him in the foyer, concern and pride in her eyes. He handed her a copy of the protective order petition and explained that the sheriff would serve it by afternoon. She took his hand and squeezed it. "No more calls from Emily begging for more money?" she asked softly. "Not unless she calls the trustee," he replied with a sad smile. In the afternoon, they sat together in the living room with the blinds lowered, waiting for the knock of the sheriff's deputy. At 3:30 p.m., the sound came. A firm rap followed by a clear voice announcing, "Sheriff's Department, Service of Protective Order." Douglas opened the door to find 2 deputies holding a thick envelope, and he signed for it. They handed him the documents and said quietly, "She has 24 hours to comply. After that, any contact is violation." When the door closed again, Douglas and Marisol looked at the papers in his hand as if they were the final page of a long, painful story. He felt both sorrow and pride settle over him. Sorrow for the daughter he had loved unconditionally, and pride that he was finally protecting his family from further harm. Over the next hour, they reviewed the documents together, then deployed the changes he'd made the night before. Closing Emily's credit lines, redirecting deeds, locking boxes in a safe. Every locked drawer and updated password was a small victory in reclaiming their lives. Late that evening, Douglas went into his study once more, now a sanctuary of security rather than a mess of vulnerability. He placed copies of the trust and protective order on his shelf next to his late father's memoirs, as if laying them beside the lessons of the past. Then he sent Emily a brief text. "Dad cares about you, but I must protect us. Please respect the protective order and trust arrangements." He knew she would reply with anger, guilt trips, or perhaps even threats, but he also knew that this time he would not respond. He closed his phone and exhaled, a deep release of tension he had carried for months. In the quiet of their home, he understood that love sometimes meant hard choices, that boundaries preserved relationships rather than destroyed them, and that his deepest act of fatherhood was setting limits so his family could heal. As he turned off his desk lamp and headed upstairs, he felt the first real peace he had known since the snake arrived, a peace born not of avoidance, but of courageous confrontation, and he resolved to stand firm, come what may, for the sake of all he still had to protect. That Friday afternoon, a sharp knock at the front door sent Douglas's heart pounding in his chest, even after all the legal protections were in place. And when he opened it, he saw Emily standing on the porch with Caleb behind her, his expression tight with anger, and she stepped forward before he could say a word, her voice trembling as she spat out, "How dare you cut me off like this? How could you sign away every penny I ever had?" He stood in the doorway, calm despite the storm of emotions roaring inside him, and replied quietly, "Emily, I didn't sign your money away. I put it into a trust for Emma and Jake so it can't be used to harm them or to fund more reckless choices. I'm protecting your children's future." She recoiled as if struck, her arms crossing defensively, and Caleb moved to stand beside her, folding his arms, while the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the porch where so many family photos once hung. "Protecting them?" she cried. "You're punishing me for helping you, for being your daughter." He shook his head. "This isn't punishment, sweetheart. It's accountability. You shipped a live snake to scare me, and then you sent threats, and you tried to use Emma and Jake as bargaining chips. That ends now." Emily's face contorted with fury and hurt, tears brimming in her eyes. "You sided with a cold lawyer instead of your own daughter," she wailed. Douglas took a steadying breath. "I sided with my duty to be a father and a grandfather. I sided with the truth that love isn't giving you a blank check for every bad mistake." Caleb stepped forward, voice low but menacing. "We know you still hold the title to that ranch house. You can't just lock us out forever, old man. We have rights." Douglas felt Marisol come up behind him and slip her hand into his. Her presence gave him strength. "I changed the deed so the house passes to the trust and is managed by professionals," he said. "You'll receive rent money for a reasonable period, but you can't live here or touch the assets. The court papers are clear." Emily's mouth fell open, her lower lip trembling. "You set all this up behind my back," she accused, her voice cracking. "I'm your daughter." He closed the door gently but firmly in Caleb's face, and Emily's stunned expression filled the gap before the door clicked shut. He leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed, and he felt Marisol's warm hand on his back. "Are you okay?" she whispered. He nodded, though tears stung his eyes. "It hurt," he admitted, "but I'm free of the fear." Behind the door, he heard Emily's muffled sobs as she and Caleb argued quietly on the porch. Then, footsteps drumming down the front walk as they got back into their car. He watched them drive away, dust rising from the gravel driveway, until their taillights disappeared around the curve. The silence felt sacred, broken only by the soft hum of cicadas outside. Inside, Marisol and Douglas surveyed the living room, noticing the faint outlines on the Persian rug where the snake's cardboard prison had sat. He bent to pick up the discarded heirloom photo that had fallen during the confrontation, its silver frame slightly dented. He set it gently back on the mantel, straightening the family picture of little Emily in her pink dress at her 3rd birthday. He ran a finger across the glass, remembering the girl who once hugged his legs and giggled as he lifted her high into the air. Now she was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. He felt Marisol's arms wrap around him, and he rested his chin on her head, drawing comfort from her steady heartbeat. "That was harder than the snake," he whispered. She pressed a kiss to his temple. "You did the right thing." He pulled back slightly to meet her eyes and closed the distance with a kiss of his own. Then he slipped his hand into his pocket, feeling the cool metal of his phone. He unlocked it and typed a short text to Margaret. "They were served today. It hurt, but it worked. Thank you." He hit send, and the confirmation ping sounded like a bell of finality. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, free to live without the dread of another crisis call, free to protect the grandchildren he adored, free to be a father in a new way, one that held love and limits together. He turned toward the window and looked out at the pale pink sky of evening settling over Houston's suburbs, the trees stirred gently by a warm breeze that carried the scent of jasmine. Marisol joined him at the window, her hand finding his, and they stood together in peace, knowing that though the wounds ran deep, they had forged a new boundary that would keep their family safe. Slowly, they walked back to the kitchen to prepare dinner, each step lightened by the knowledge that the hidden bombshell of revenge Emily had delivered in that box had become the catalyst for their liberation, and for the promise of a calmer, more honest future.